האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov and good evening, everyone. We're in the Zera Shimshon on Parshas Chayei Sarah. We're going to be doing Os Ches, that's section 8. We're going to look at a few psukim now from Parshas Chayei Sarah to give us a little bit of a head start into the subject matter that the Zera Shimshon is going to be discussing. So these psukim come from Perek Chav Dalid, psukim Beis through Dalid, and they deal with Avraham giving a command to his servant Eliezer to find a wife for his son Yitzchak, but to make sure that the wife does not come from Eretz Canaan, from the land that they live in, but rather he tells Eliezer to go back to his birthplace, to where he grew up and to where his family still lives, and to find a wife from there. So here are the psukim, starting again, Chaf Daled Pasuk Beis. Vayomer Avraham el Avdo, and Avraham said to his servant, Zakan Beiso, the elder of his household, Hamoshel Bechol Asher Lo, who was put in control of everything that belonged to Avraham, Sim no Yodcha Tachas Yurechi, place now your hand under my thigh. That was a way of taking an oath. So he was telling Eliezer, I want you to take an oath. Va'ashbiacha, this is Pasuk Gimel, Va'ashbiacha b'Hashem, and I will make you swear by the name of Hashem, Elokei Hashamayim ve'Elokei Haaretz, the God of the Shamayim, the God of the heavens and the God of earth, Asher lo sikach isha livni, that you will not take a wife for my son, Mibenos HaKnani, from the daughters of the Canaanite tribes in the place where they live. Asher Anochi Yoshev Bikirbo, that I dwell in his midst. Pasuk Daled, Ki el artzi ve'el moladati telech, but rather to my land and to my birthplace you should go. V'lokachta isha livini liyitzchak, and you will take a wife for my son, for Yitzchak, from there. And of course, Eliezer goes back and finds Rivka in a very unique and extraordinary way and brings her back. And of course, Yitzchak marries Rivka to continue the destiny and the future of the Jewish people. So let's jump right into the Zera Shimshon here. And Os Ches, Pasuk. The Pasuk says, this is one of the psukim we just read. Vayomer Avraham el Avdo, and Avraham said to his servant, Zakan Beiso, the elder of his household, Hamoshel Bechol Asher Lo, who had been put in charge of all that belonged to Avram, V'chule, etc. Yesh Makshim, some people ask a question. My osakra la'ashmo inon. What is the pasuk coming to teach us with the words Hamoshel Bechol Asher Lo, that Eliezer, Abraham's servant, had been put in control of everything that belonged to him? So some commentators, the Zera Shimshon tells us, ask, why does the Torah say those words? What is it coming to teach us with that? Now we're going to the top of the next column. Demai nafkamina, because what is the practical difference? Imoshel b'chol asher lo, if Eliezer is in charge of all of the things that Avram had, what does that have to do with the mission that Avraham was sending Eliezer on, and the oath that he was giving to Eliezer, that he was administering to Eliezer? Why does the Torah have to add in the words that Eliezer, Avram's servant, was in control of everything that he had? What does this information give us, and what does it add for us? What knowledge is it adding for us that is actually relevant and needed for us at this point? Uladizon, and according to us, meaning the Zera Shimshon always means by that, and according to his view, Od Kasha, there's another question. Af al Zakan Beso, even on the words Zakan Beso, that Eliezer is identified as the elder of the house of Avraham. Demai nafkamina nami bozeh, because what is the practical difference also of this by knowing this information? So the Zera Shimshon opens with two seemingly straightforward questions. The Torah tells us two things about Eliezer, who is Abraham's servant and who we know from previously in the Torah, who's already been identified in the Torah. But the Torah chooses to tell us that he is Zakan Beso, he's the elder of Avram's household, and he is Moshel B'chol Asher Lo, he has been placed in control of everything that belongs to Avraham. And so the Zera Shimshon says, why are those two pieces of information necessary? What's the nafkamina? What's the practical difference that the Torah felt the need felt compelled to tell us that those two pieces of information about Eliezer? Why didn't the Torah just say, Avram called in Eliezer and said to him, you need to swear, I want you to swear, and here's your mission. And that's all we would need to know. Why do we need this other, apparently extraneous information? So the Zera Shimshon continues, V'yesh lomar, and we can say, Shaha pasuk itzterich litaretz. The pasuk in the Torah needed to answer a question. Lama Avraham sholach as avdo. Why did Avraham send his servant, likach isha liyitzchak, to take a wife, to find and to bring back a wife for Yitzchak? V'halo, and isn't it true? Ha'avodim chashudim al kol ha'isurin. Servants, and here we're talking about avodim kenaanim, non-Jewish servants of the type that Eliezer was, are suspected of committing all different types of prohibitions. Umikol shkein al ha'arayos. And how much more so are they suspected of violating rules of sexual propriety? Because so we find, and this is a quote from a Gemara in Brachos, shenoshim ve'avodim ein mezamnim. The Mishnah over there in Masechta Brachos on Daf Mem Hey, Amud Beis, tells us that women may make a zimun and avodim may make a zimun. That means they may say the introductory paragraph for before Birchas Hamazon if there are at least three people, three of them, three women or three avodim. However, they should not join up to make a zimun together. Mishum pritzusa de avde, the Gemara says, because of the immorality of the avodim. Avodim have a tendency to be immoral, especially when it comes with issues having to dealing with women. And so the halacha, the Gemara, did not want women and avodim to be able to make a zimun together, even though it was should have been technically permissible. The Gemara over there forbids it because it didn't want there to be any unnecessary mingling and mixing between women and the avodim, the non-Jewish servants. Ulazeh Omar Hakosov, and to this question, to address this question about how Avraham could entrust his non-Jewish servant Eliezer with the mission of bringing back a wife for Yitzchak and not be suspicious of Eliezer's activities on the journey back with the woman that would be found. The reason Avraham could do that was what the pasuk said, Zakan Beso. Eliezer wasn't just a regular servant, a regular Eved Kanani. He was the elder of Avram Avinu's house. Ki de'isav a parak Gimel de Yuma, as the Gemara states in the third parak of Meseches Yuma, Eliezer Zokein v'Yoshev b'Yeshiva Haya. Eliezer was an elder, meaning a scholar, a Torah scholar, and he sat in yeshiva. He actually learned and studied with other Torah scholars in a type of yeshiva setting at that time. Obviously, the yeshiva setting then did not necessarily mean exactly what we mean by a yeshiva setting now, but whatever it was called, Chazal teach us that the Jewish people always had places to study Torah and to learn about the mitzvos and to pass on the traditions of the Jewish people, and those places were called yeshivot, where they would sit and study. So Eliezer did that, and he was an elder, he was a scholar. Shenemar, and the Gemara there quotes our pasuk, Vayomer Avraham el Avdo Zakan Beso. And Avraham said to his servant, the elder of his household. So the Gemara says, you see, the Torah refers to Eliezer as a zokain, which doesn't just mean an older gentleman, it means a scholar, an elder in terms of knowledge. He had Torah knowledge. Who, the Gemara continues, who damesik Eliezer. This is the same person who is referred to in another place in the Torah as damesek Eliezer, which literally means Eliezer of Damascus. But the Gemara says, why is he called Damesek Eliezer? Shedole umashke, because he draws from and gives water to others, mitoras rabo, from the Torah of his master, la'acherim, to other people, ad kan, until here is a quote from the Gemara. So the Zera Shimshon says, please make no mistake about the stature of this Eliezer. He was a Torah scholar, and that's why he's called a Zakan Beso, a Zaken, an elder of the house of Avraham, and he studied Torah. And not only did he study Torah, but he's referred to as Damesek Eliezer because he could mashke, he could take from, he knew it so well. He was so conversant in the Torah that he learned that he could take from it, draw from it, and mashke, and give over to it like water to other people. And that's what he did. He taught Torah. He was a student of Torah and a teacher of Torah. V'im hayumelamed la'acherim v'zakein. And if we have seen now, as we have seen, if Eliezer was a teacher of Torah to other people, and he was an elder, a Torah scholar, pshita vadai, it's obvious that definitely shelo hayaparutz ba'arayus, that he was not someone who would be engaged, or we would ever have to, Abraham would never have to suspect him of being engaged in arayos. So let's pause here, because the Zera Shimshon has answered one of his two questions. And that question was, why did the Torah refer to Eliezer as Zakan Beso, the elder of Avram's household? And so the Zera Shimshon has brought in a Gemara in Brachos and a Gemara in Masechta Yuma to tell us that that phrase, Zakan Beso, the elder of Avram's household, wasn't just a chronological issue. It wasn't just telling us that that Eliezer was the oldest person in Avram's household, or even it wasn't just telling us that he was given a place of respect. It was telling us he was a zaken in the Torah sense, in the Jewish sense of the word. He was a Torah scholar. And not just was he was a Torah scholar, he was called Damesek Eliezer because he taught Torah to others as well as studying Torah himself. And that answers the question as to why Avraham was able to send Eliezer on this mission of bringing back a wife for Yitzchak, and did not have to be concerned about the usual prohibition, the usual prescription in the Torah of suspecting avodim that they will be engaged in immorality and sexual immorality especially, and Avraham did not have to worry about that because of Eliezer's exalted status as a Torah scholar and teacher of Torah. So now let's continue on, because Zera Shimshon, of course, has to deal with another question in addition to the question about Zakan Beso. Ela dekoshe, but we have a question on this. Eich efsher she'Eliezer yiyeh melamed la'acherim Toras Rabo. How is it possible that Eliezer was someone who taught others the Torah from his master Abraham, the Tofes Yeshiva, and he was someone who was able to sit and study in a yeshiva, v'ha'kai malon, and we hold in the halacha as brought down by the Rambam, by Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah, she'osur lo'odom lelamed es avdo Torah. The Rambam states in the 8th parak of Hilchos Avodim that it's forbidden for a man to teach his Eved Kanani, his non-Jewish servant, Torah. Such a thing is forbidden and brought down in the Rambam in Halacha. Ubevadai she'Avraham, and certainly Avraham, she'kiyem afilu eruve tavshilin, who fulfilled the mitzvahs of the Torah, and even according to Chazal, according to one opinion in Chazal, he fulfilled eruve tavshilin, the laws about mixing food when you have a yontif and a Shabbos coming together, and that's a rabbinic law. Avraham even fulfilled the rabbinic laws. Lo aser iser zeh, so certainly we can't say, we can't suggest that Avraham violated the prohibition of teaching his own Eved Kanani Torah. So the Zera Shimshon here is saying, before we get to the second problem, this answer on our first question, that Eliezer was a Torah scholar, is problematic itself. It presents it leads us into another question, which is, how did he become a Torah scholar? And don't say Avraham taught him, because we see in the Rambam that it's forbidden for a man to teach his Eved Kanani, his non-Jewish Eved. It's forbidden for him to teach him Torah studies. So how in the world could Eliezer become a Torah scholar? Now, at this point, we're going to skip a section, a bit of a complicated and intricate discussion, starting in the next paragraph where it says, Umnam Garsinon, and the Zera Shimshon brings in a Gemara from Ksubas, and there's different ways of understanding the Gemara, and he brings in different Rishonim. But we're going to move ahead to the next page. So please go with me all the way to the next page, which is Daf Reish Mem Gimel, and come down in the second column there to where it says, let's see, this would be the third paragraph in the second column, where it says, Ume'ata novo le'inyanenu. What goes on in that whole section that we're skipping, as I said, is an involved, very learned discussion based on a Gemara and how to understand it, and different Rishonim are brought to help understand it. In the final analysis, Zera Shimshon is going to take the information from there and bring us back, come back to the subject he was discussing about how did Eliezer become a Torah scholar. So let us go from Ume'ata. Ume'ata novo le'inyanenu. And from now that we learned all of that section that we just skipped, we can come back to our subject matter. Hine Eliezer, behold Eliezer, Torah. It's impossible to say that he knew the words of Torah, the subjects of Torah, kodem she'ia eved la'Avraham, before he became an eved to Avraham. Meaning, if Avraham wasn't able to teach him because he was an eved to Avraham, and you can't teach your eved Kanani Torah, so maybe you would think Eliezer somehow learned the Torah before he was became an eved to Avraham. So the Zera Shimshon says that's impossible. Shahare lo hoyu makirim klau behakodesh baruch hu. The people at that time did not at all have any recognition of the existence of Hashem. Not only did they not know Torah or mitzvos and were incapable of discussing Torah subjects and learning about Torah subjects, but on a much more fundamental level, they didn't even know about the existence of Hashem. That's how totally and completely the blight and the plague of idolatry of Avodah Zarah had spread and covered the entire world, to the point where no one knew anything about Hashem, except, of course, for Avraham. And Avraham began to spread the message of monotheism, but no one else knew anything about Hashem at all. So Eliezer certainly could not have learned Torah from anyone, anywhere, before he came to the household to be an Eved in the household of Avraham. Kemoshe Pirish Rashi, as Rashi explains, al pasuk, on the pasuk in our parsha, just a few psukim after these insight further in the story of Avram and Eliezer, where Avraham says, al pasuk, on the pasuk that says, Hashem Elokei Hashamayim, Hashem, who is the God of the heavens, Asher lekochani mi beis avi, who took me from my father's household. We'll come back to that very important and interesting Rashi in a moment, but basically the Zera Shimshon is alluding to and mentioning that Rashi, because Rashi there says none of the people in the time of Avram knew anything about Hashem, which is the point that he's making. Ve'ech lamad Torah. So how could Eliezer have studied Torah? Ve'halo eved ein lo panai lilmod. A servant, in addition to any other issues, has no time to be studying. Im lo yitain lo rabo rishus, unless his master gives him permission to take time off from his work and of his labors and study Torah. Ve'al korchoch tzarich lomar, and therefore it appears that we're compelled to say she'Avraham nasan lo rishus, that Avraham did give permission to Eliezer to study Torah. And we'll continue with the Zera Shimshon's thoughts on this in a moment. Let's just go back to the Rashi. It's very striking. Rashi says that Avraham, when he first starts talking to Eliezer, he refers to the God of, a little later, he refers to the God of Shamayim va'aretz, the God of the heavens and the earth. But when Avraham refers to his own birth and growing up back in his father's household, in the household of Terach, he doesn't say Elokei Hashamayim ve'Elokei ha'aretz. He doesn't say the God of Shamayim and the God of the earth. He just says Elokei Hashamayim, the God of the Shamayim. So Rashi says, why would Avraham, in the same exact conversation with the same person, with Eliezer, at one point use the phrase to refer to Hashem as Elokei Hashamayim, and a little later say Elokei Hashamayim v'ha'aretz? Why change the way that Avraham referred to Hashem? And so Rashi answers and says, when Avraham was referring to the present time, that when he and Eliezer were having the conversation, then he used the phrase Elokei Hashamayim ve'Elokei ha'aretz, because there was an awareness that Avram had been able to spread by devoting all of his energies and his life force to it, of an idea of Hashem. He had begun to spread the ideas of monotheism and the idea that Hashem created the world. And so you could talk about a God that was not just in Shemayim, but that was actually people knew about on earth as well. However, when Abraham said to Eliezer and referred back to when Hashem took me out of my father's household, at that time, only Abraham knew about Hashem. He hadn't yet had the opportunity to spread that message to anyone else, and the world was completely devoid of the idea, even the idea of Hashem and a knowledge of Hashem's name, and therefore Abraham couldn't talk about a world full of knowledge of Elokei Hashamayim ve'Elokei ha'aretz. He could only say Elokei Hashamayim. God, of course, has always existed and always will exist, but sometimes people on earth don't know about it. So he could only refer to Elokei Hashamayim, but not yet Elokei ha'aretz. And that's the Rashi that the Zera Shimshon brought in to prove his point that Eliezer certainly would not have been able to study Torah before he joined the household of Avram Avinu. So now let's continue. V'hadra kushyon liduchta. And our question has now returned to its original place and prominence. Eich nosan rishus le'eved lilmo Torah. How did Avraham give permission, which he apparently must have done, to his servant Eliezer to study Torah? And that's our question. It's forbidden, as we saw in the words of the Rambam, for a man to teach his Eved Kanani, his non-Jewish servant, Torah. Such a thing is forbidden. And the Zera Shimshon already said Abraham certainly would have been careful not to violate that prohibition. V'nesinas rishus have ki'ilu lamda. And giving permission for Avram to give permission to Eliezer to study Torah, even without actively teaching him, would have been tantamount to teaching him. In other words, Avraham not only must have refrained from teaching Eliezer Torah, he also must have refrained from giving Eliezer the opportunity to study Torah by saying, sure, Eliezer, you can take off some time and go to the yeshiva where people study. People who I've taught previously are studying Torah, and you can join them and study with them, because the Zera Shimshon says that's tantamount, that is basically the equivalent of teaching him Torah, and it would have been a violation of the prohibition. So certainly we would have to assume Avram would not do that either. In such a case, not only would he have been giving Eliezer the chance to study here and there for a few minutes on his own, but he would have been letting him go and sit and study in yeshiva, as it appeared and as the Gemara understood the phrase, an elder of his household. He would be allowing Eliezer to go and study and become a Torah scholar. And because of this question, this problem of how Eliezer became so knowledgeable in Torah, the pasuk added the words Hamoshel bechol asher lo, that Eliezer was in charge of everything that belonged to Avram Avinu. We've moved to the top of the next page. Shelo hayu mishubad la'Avraham tamid. The Torah is teaching us that Eliezer was not under Abraham's thumb, so to speak, was not serving Abraham 24/7 all the time like other avodim, like other slaves. Ela Avram hayemenicho birishuso, but Abraham gave him permission lehis asek, to become involved kisheyirtze, as he wanted. Eliezer had the freedom and the time to get involved in other activities as he wanted. Kamo Adon, like a master. He was Moshel B'chol Asher Lo. He wasn't in a low position. He was in an administrative position. He was in a top position. So he had much more freedom and much more time to be able to do other things and pursue other interests. And his interest was studying Torah. Ubishvil zeh, and because of this fact that Eliezer had a unique position in Avram's household, a leadership position, ha'eved me'atzmo nischakem, the servant Eliezer on his own was able to become learned, to become a chacham in Torah, le'itos hapanai, in the times that were available and free to him to do so. So let's pause here, because now the Zera Shimshon has answered his second question. And that is, he already told us why the Torah identified Eliezer as a Zakan Beso, as an elder of Avram's household, and a Torah scholar who would certainly not be suspected of doing anything wrong and could be trusted with the mission of bringing back a wife for Yitzchak. And now the Zera Shimshon says, why did the Torah say, HaMoshel B'chol Asher Lo, he was in charge of everything in Avram's house, to tell us that his position of authority and his position of being in charge of others allowed Eliezer to have delegate to other servants to do the work, and allowed Eliezer to pursue his tremendous desire to study Torah. Not that Abraham taught him, but rather that Eliezer could go and use his free time at his discretion to study Torah with those people who knew in the yeshiva, those people who were studying Torah that Abraham had spread. And he would be able to go and learn Torah there. And he was so successful that over time he became a Torah scholar who had the ability to teach Torah to others. So the Zera Shimshon has answered both of his questions, but now he's going to continue and explain things in a little bit of a different way to offer an alternative understanding of the situation with Eliezer. Ukalefi ma'di amrinu b'per gimel diyuma. And according to the Gemara that we've already quoted from the third parak of Maseches Yuma, HaMoshel B'chol Asher Lo, where the Gemara said, what does it mean that Eliezer was in charge of everything belonging to Avram? The Gemara said it means HaMoshel B'Toras Rabbo. He was in control of the Torah of his master. He was knowledgeable and conversant in the Torah of his master. Nuchal Lomar B'derach Acher. We are now able to explain that phrase in that Gemara in a different way. Meaning, I just want to emphasize, this doesn't mean that the Zera Shimshon is undercutting or undermining in any way the explanation he gave before. Rather, he's saying we've answered our questions and we have a solid explanation, but now to both of our questions. But now he says we can kind of delve a little deeper into the Gemara and offer an alternative explanation. Eliezer lo hayalomed, we can say that perhaps Eliezer did not learn Ella halachos shel eved, the laws having to do with an eved, with a servant, with a slave, with an eved kanani, within the laws of a non-Jewish slave, which he of course needed to know. V'zeh bevadai shemuter lo lilmod, and this was certainly permissible for him to learn. For Eliezer to study the Torah laws, the Jewish laws, even though the Torah wasn't given yet, but to study the laws that were known about a relationship between a servant, a slave, and a master, that was certainly permissible. In order for him to be able to know and to perform those commandments that he was obligated in. As the Gemara says in the 7th parak of Maseches Sanhedrin, even non-Jews upon whom the Gemara says there is a general prohibition for them to study Torah, nonetheless, the Gemara says, when it comes to the 7 mitzvos b'nei Noach that non-Jews are obligated to observe, yecholim lilmod haTorah, they are absolutely allowed and permitted to study the Torah laws having to do with their 7 mitzvos. And when Eliezer became an elder and he was sitting and studying with the other Torah scholars, lo hayumilamed, he would only teach he would only teach the laws of avodim to other avodim. So the Zera Shimshon is saying we might take a dramatically different approach and say that Eliezer did not become a general universal Torah scholar. He wasn't studying all the laws of the Torah. Rather, he was studying the laws that were applicable to him, the laws of Hilchos Avodim. And when it says he taught Torah to others, it means he taught to other Avodim the laws that he had mastered in this area of Hilchos Avodim, of the laws of slaves and of Avodim Kananim, of non-Jewish slaves. And now the Zera Shimshon continues to show how this, in a way, fits better into the Gemara. V'diek ha-Gemara lomar, and the Gemara was very careful to say, shehoyedole umashke, that Eliezer was able to draw out and to give to others mitoras rabo, from the Torah of his master, le'acherim, to other people. It was careful to use that specific wording. The lamule lememar mitoras rabo, because we would have to ask, why did the Gemara say that Eliezer took from the Torah of his master? Halo hayadai lomar. It should have been enough to say dole umashke ha-Torah le'acherim, that Eliezer took and gave over the Torah studies, his study of Torah, to others. Why did the Gemara specifically say he took from the Torah of his master? So the Zera Shimshon now continues, Elavadai, but definitely what the Gemara means to say is Shedafka Toras Rabo. It means specifically he took from the Torah of his master, Tahainu Hilchos Avodim, that it was the laws of slaves, of non-Jewish slaves, Avodim Ketanim Hayimalame. That's what he took and taught to other people, not just general laws of Torah, but rather Toras Rabo, the Torah having to do with his relationship with his master, meaning Hilchos Avodim, the laws of slaves. That's what Eliezer studied and focused on and taught to others. The Dieg Nami, and the Gemara was also careful, Lomar, to say le'acherim, to others, dahainu avodim acherim. When it says others, it means others avodim, just like Eliezer. Klomar acherim shahayu avodim kamohu, meaning he taught to other avodim. He didn't teach to the general public. He wasn't going around giving lecture series to the general public, and he wasn't teaching other regular people. He was teaching other avodim the laws that he had mastered in this specific area of Hilchos Avodim. And also in this approach, this new second alternative approach that Zera Shimshon is offering, it's the Richlal Omar, the pasuk still needs to use the phrase Hamoshel B'chol asher lo, that Eliezer was put in charge of everything that belonged to Avraham. Because after the Torah was compelled, mitam hanizkar la'el, from the reasons we've explained before, Lomar, to say Zekan Beso, that Eliezer was a elder, meaning a scholar in the household of Avram, Shahayu Zakein v'Yoshev b'Yeshiva, which meant he wasn't just older, but he actually was a scholar who studied Torah with others. After we say that, the Yesh Kusha, then the question comes up, Torah. Then the question that we've been dealing with all along pops up. If he was a Torah scholar, how did he learn Torah? Avram couldn't teach him Torah. Therefore, the pasuk continues, Hamoshel b'chol asher lo, that Eliezer was in charge of everything. Demashma'uso Hamoshel b'toras rabo. This implies he had control over the Torah of his master. Klomar rak b'dinei ha'avodim. Eliezer had knowledge and had mastery over the Torah of his relationship with Avram Avinu in terms of b'dinei ha'avodim and the laws of being an eved. Hayalomed, this he learned, umelamed, and taught to others. So just to recap briefly, the Zera Shimshon has offered us two different ways to understand the different statements in Chazal about the subject of Eliezer and his Torah scholarship. The answers to his two questions are, as I said before, are totally solid. The Torah mentions that Eliezer is a Zakein, a Torah scholar, in order to allay any concerns we might have as to why Abraham entrusted him with this mission of bringing back a wife, when normally you would never trust an Eved Kanani being alone with a woman on a long journey like that. But Eliezer was unique and was a Torah scholar and could be trusted. And number two, he was Moshel B'chol Asher Lo. He was able to have the time to study Torah on his own and pursue that interest without Avram Avinu ever having to teach him, because that would have been a violation of the halacha for Avram to do so. So the Torah says, don't worry about that. Eliezer studied on his own and had the time to do so because of his administrative position in the household of Avraham. Yasher Koch to everyone for joining us this week, and God willing, we look forward to studying more in the Zera Shimshon next week on next week's Parsha.